I never thought yoga would change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. As a busy wife balancing a demanding husband and household, yoga was supposed to be my escape. The studio was tranquil, bathed in sunlight with soft, soothing music playing in the background. And there he was, Ethan, the instructor with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could calm the stormiest mind. Ethan wasn't just handsome. He carried himself with an effortless grace that made him impossible to ignore. Initially, I focused on my poses and breathing, keeping things professional, but Ethan had a way of making everyone feel special. "Your form is impressive, Claire," he said during a session, his hands lightly adjusting my posture. His touch sent a jolt through me. After the class, he approached me with a kind smile. "Have you ever considered private sessions?" he asked. Caught off guard, I hesitated, but eventually said yes. "That sounds like a great idea," I replied nervously. Our first private session was focused and professional, but something about being alone in the studio felt undeniably intimate. As weeks went by, our conversations grew more personal. We talked about our lives, our dreams, and the things we never told anyone else. "Yoga is about more than flexibility," Ethan said one evening, his voice low. "It's about connecting with yourself and with others." His words lingered in my mind long after the session ended. I couldn't ignore the way his presence made me feel. One evening, as we finished a session, his hand brushed mine while passing me a towel. The spark was undeniable. "Claire, are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing my hesitation. His concern felt genuine, and I found myself opening up. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. I feel like I'm rediscovering myself here." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "You deserve to feel alive," he said, his voice soft but firm. For the first time in years, I felt seen, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. The next session, I found myself more nervous than usual. My heart raced every time Ethan's eyes met mine. As the session ended, he lingered, rolling up his mat slowly as if waiting for me to say something. "Would you like to stay for tea?" he asked, his voice calm, yet his eyes hinted at something deeper. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Tea sounds nice," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. We sat on the studio floor, sipping herbal tea as the evening sun painted the room in shades of gold. "You're different from the others," he said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. "There's a strength in you that you don't see in yourself." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks. "I don't know about that," I said, laughing nervously. Ethan reached out, his hand lightly touching mine. "You should believe it," he said, his gaze locking with mine. The air between us grew thick with tension, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Ethan, I started, unsure of what I was about to say. But before I could finish, he leaned in slightly. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not," I replied quickly, surprising even myself. This feels so right," he finished, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Before I could overthink, I closed the distance between us. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft but charged with unspoken emotion. Time seemed to stand still as we lost ourselves in the moment, the world outside the studio fading away. When we finally pulled apart, I searched his eyes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "This changes everything," I said, my voice trembling with both fear and exhilaration. Ethan nodded, his hand still resting lightly on mine. "Only if we let it," he replied. "What do you want, Claire?" His question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an answer. Not yet. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, "but I can't deny how I feel when I'm with you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then let's figure it out together," he said. As I left the studio that night, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I was stepping into uncharted territory. The days that followed were filled with stolen glances and lingering touches during our session. Ethan seemed to sense my hesitations, but he never pressured me. Instead, he simply made me feel wanted. One evening, after a particularly intense session, he suggested we go for a walk. The park near the studio was quiet, the night air cool against my skin. "Do you ever feel trapped?" I asked, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at me, his expression contemplative. Sometimes, he admitted, but I've learned that freedom comes from within. His words resonated deeply, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't before. I feel like I've been living someone else's life, I confess. You deserve to live for yourself, Claire, Ethan said, his tone gentle yet firm. As we sat on a bench under the glow of a street lamp, he reached for my hand. No one can decide your happiness but you. I nodded, my heart pounding as his words sank in. For the first time in years, I felt like someone truly understood me. Before I could stop myself, I leaned closer and his arms instinctively wrapped around me. The kiss we shared under the soft glow of the street lamp was different, deeper, more deliberate. When we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. "What do you want, Claire?" he whispered. "I want to feel alive," I replied, my voice trembling with emotion. "And you make me feel that way." Ethan's smile was soft, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Then let's take it one day at a time," he said. But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at the edges of my mind. Returning home that night, I found my husband, Mark, waiting for me in the kitchen. "Hey," he said, his smile warm but tired. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile as I placed my bag down. The weight of my secret felt heavier than ever. Mark poured me a glass of wine and joined me at the table. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone curious but gentle. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Just busy with yoga," I lied, avoiding his gaze. As Mark continued talking about his day, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost unbearable. I knew I couldn't keep living this way. A choice had to be made, one that would change everything. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. At the studio, Ethan noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. "I can't keep doing this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm lying to Mark, and it's tearing me apart." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Claire, but what do you want to do about it?" I hesitated, the weight of my choices crashing down on me. "I need to figure out what's right for everyone," I said finally. Ethan stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on my arm. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Don't settle for anything less than what makes you truly happy," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. His words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth any longer. When I walked through the door, Mark was in the living room reading. He looked up and smiled. "How was yoga?" he asked. I froze, the question hitting me harder than it should have. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. His smile faded as he set his book down. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched across his face. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my heart pounding. Over the next hour, I poured my heart out, confessing everything, the yoga, Ethan, and the feelings I couldn't ignore. Mark sat silently, his face unreadable. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, he spoke. "Claire, I wish you had come to me sooner," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't know how, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I felt so lost and I didn't want to hurt you. Mark reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We've both made mistakes, Claire, but if you want to fix this, so do I." His words took me by surprise, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. "I do," I said, my voice steady. Mark nodded, his expression softening. "Then let's work on this together," he said, one step at a time. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The next day, I went to the studio to tell Ethan my decision. His face fell, but he nodded, understanding. "I'm glad you're doing what feels right," he said softly. "You deserve to be happy, Claire." As I walked away, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Mark and I worked tirelessly to rebuild what we had lost. It wasn't easy, but day by day, we grew stronger together. Through it all, I learned that true happiness comes from honesty. And sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most meaningful growth.